She had nothing but a broken violin until he heard her play in the cold. Nobody could have predicted what happened next. The music that came from that cracked, weathered instrument would change to lives forever, and reveal a truth so beautiful it would bring an entire town to tears. But let me start from the beginning, because this story will make you believe in miracles again. It was December in 1887, and the wind cut through the streets of Silver Creek like a razor blade, the kind of cold that made your bones ache and your breath hang in the air like ghostly whispers. Most folks had hurried indoors hours ago, seeking warmth by their fireplaces. But there she was, a young woman no more than 22, standing on the corner of Main Street and Cedar. Her name was Clara Bell, and her fingers were so numb from the cold that she could barely feel the violin strings beneath them. The instrument itself looked like it had seen better days, much better days. The wood was cracked along the side, held together with what appeared to be wire and sheer determination. One of the tuning pegs was missing entirely, replaced by a crude wooden substitute that barely held the string in place. But Clara didn't seem to notice any of that. Her eyes were closed, and despite the bitter wind that whipped her dark hair across her face, she played with a passion that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her soul. The melody that escaped from that broken violin was haunting, a mix of Irish folk tunes and something entirely her own creation. It drifted through the empty streets like smoke, weaving between the wooden storefronts and saloon doors, carrying with it a sadness that could break your heart and a hope that could mend it all at once. Most people who passed by that evening hurried faster, pulling their coats tighter around themselves. They had their own problems, their own struggles in this harsh frontier town where making ends meet was a daily battle. A young woman with a broken violin wasn't their concern, but not everyone passed by. Samuel Turner had been walking the streets of Silver Creek for hours. He wasn't from around here. That much was obvious from his clean-shaven face and the way he carried himself. Most men in Silver Creek had weathered hands and sun-beaten faces, marked by years of hard labor and harder winters. Samuel looked different, softer, maybe, like he'd never spent a day working cattle or mining silver from the unforgiving earth. He'd arrived on the afternoon train with nothing but a single leather satchel and a look in his eyes that spoke of running from something. What that something was, nobody knew, and in a town like Silver Creek, folks had learned not to ask too many questions about a man's past. Samuel had been wandering aimlessly, trying to clear his head, when the sound stopped him dead in his tracks. At first, he thought he was imagining it. The cold could play tricks on your mind, after all. But as he turned the corner onto Main Street, there she was. Clara Bell, though he didn't know her name yet, stood beneath a flickering street lamp, her violin tucked beneath her chin, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The sight of her there, playing with such dedication despite the obvious poverty of her circumstances, stirred something in Samuel's chest that he hadn't felt in years. He found himself stepping closer, drawn by the music like a moth to flame. Each note seemed to tell a story of loss, of longing, of dreams that refused to die even when everything else had crumbled away. Samuel understood that feeling all too well as he watched. A few coins clinked into the worn hat at Clara's feet. Not many. Silver Creek wasn't exactly overflowing with generous souls. but enough to suggest that others, too, were moved by what they heard. Samuel reached into his coat pocket and felt the weight of his own coin purse. He'd been careful with his money since arriving in town, knowing he'd need to make it last until he figured out what came next in his life. But something about this young woman, about the way she poured her heart into every note despite having so little, made him want to help. He stepped forward and dropped a silver dollar into her hat. The sound of the coin landing made Clara's eyes snap open. She looked up at Samuel with a mixture of surprise and gratitude, her bow never stopping its movement across the strings. Her eyes were the deepest brown he'd ever seen, and in them he caught a glimpse of something that took his breath away, pure, undiluted talent. When Clara finally finished her song, she lowered her violin carefully, as if she were placing a sleeping child in its cradle. Her hands were shaking from the cold or from emotion. Samuel couldn't tell. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That's very kind of you." Samuel found himself at a loss for words. He'd heard music before, plenty of it. Growing up back east, he'd attended concerts and recitals, had sat in grand concert halls where famous musicians played instruments worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. But he'd never heard anything like what had just come from Clara's broken violin. "I should be thanking you," he finally managed to say. "That was beautiful, doesn't even begin to describe it." Clara's cheeks flushed pink, and Samuel couldn't tell if it was from the cold or from his compliment. She looked down at her violin, running her thumb along one of the visible cracks. "She's not much to look at," Clara said with a sad smile. "Found her in an old trunk when my grandmother passed. The case was rotted through, and as you can see, she's held together more by hope than by craftsmanship at this point." "Hope can be stronger than people think," Samuel said, surprised by his own words. He hadn't felt particularly hopeful about anything in months. "No," Samuel admitted. "Just arrived today, actually. I'm between destinations, you might say." "Aren't we all?" Clara murmured. And there was something in her voice that suggested she understood exactly what it meant to be between destinations. They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, two strangers brought together by music and circumstance on a cold December night. Finally, Clara began packing up her violin, wrapping it carefully in a worn piece of cloth. "Will you be here tomorrow?" Samuel asked, surprising himself with the question. Clara paused in her packing and looked up at him. "I'm here most evenings. Not much else to do, and sometimes people are generous enough to spare a coin or two." She hesitated, then added, "Why do you ask?" "I'd like to hear you play again," Samuel said honestly. "If that's all right with you." A genuine smile crossed Clara's face, the first real smile Samuel had seen from her. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." What Clara didn't know was that Samuel Turner hadn't always been a drifter with a single leather satchel to his name. 3 months earlier, he'd been Professor Samuel Turner of the Boston Conservatory of Music, one of the most respected music instructors on the East Coast. He'd had it all: a prestigious position, a comfortable home, the respect of his peers, and a reputation for nurturing young musical talent. His students had gone on to perform in the finest concert halls in New York and Philadelphia. His own compositions had been performed by symphonies from Boston to Chicago. But all of that had come crashing down in a single, devastating moment. It had been a Tuesday afternoon in September. Samuel had been working late in his office at the conservatory, preparing for the next day's lessons, when he'd received the telegram that changed everything. Killed in a carriage accident in San Francisco. She'd been his only remaining family, the one person who'd believed in him when he was just a boy with big dreams and calloused fingers from practicing piano until all hours of the night. The grief had hit him like a physical blow. For weeks, he'd been unable to teach, unable to compose, unable to even listen to music without feeling like his heart was being torn apart all over again. His students had been understanding at first, but as his absence stretched on, the conservatory had been forced to find a replacement. By the time Samuel had finally emerged from his grief enough to function, his position had been filled. His reputation, built over 20 years of dedicated work, had crumbled in a matter of months. Worse than that, his passion for music, the very thing that had defined him since childhood, seemed to have died, along with Margaret. So he'd packed his belongings, sold everything he couldn't carry, and bought a ticket on the first train, heading west. He'd told himself he just needed to get away, to find some place where nobody knew Professor Samuel Turner and his fall from grace. He'd been wandering from town to town ever since, trying to outrun his past and hoping to find some reason to care about the future, until he'd heard Clara play. Clara was always there, wrapped in her thin coat, her broken violin tucked beneath her chin as she played for whoever might listen. Each night, Samuel would drop coins into her hat and stay to listen. Music about the weather, about their dreams for the future. Clara never asked about his past, and Samuel was grateful for that. He wasn't ready to explain who he used to be, or why he was running from it. She'd grown up on a small farm outside of Silver Creek with her grandmother, who'd taught her to play violin using an old instruction book that was falling apart at the seams. Her grandmother had been a music teacher back in Ireland before immigrating to America, and she'd passed on both her love of music and her precious violin to Clara. When her grandmother died 2 years earlier, Clara had discovered that the farm was mortgaged to the hilt. She'd sold everything she could, but it hadn't been enough to save their home. Now she lived in a tiny room above Murphy's general store, for a place to sleep and 1 meal a day. She used to tell me that music was the language of the heart, Clara told Samuel one evening as they walked toward Murphy's store. She said that as long as I could make music, I'd never truly be alone. Samuel felt a lump form in his throat. His own grandmother had told him something similar when he was a boy, struggling to master his first piano pieces. It was on a particularly cold Thursday evening that everything changed. Clara had been playing for nearly an hour when she began a piece that made Samuel's blood run cold. He recognized it immediately. It was one of his own compositions, a piece he'd written 5 years earlier for his advanced students at the conservatory. It was called Elegy for a Lost Dream, and he'd never published it. The only copies in existence were the handwritten sheets he'd given to 3 of his most promising students. Samuel watched in amazement as Clara played his composition with an interpretation that was somehow both faithful to his original intent and uniquely her own. When she finished, Samuel couldn't contain himself any longer. "Where did you learn that piece?" he asked, his voice barely steady. Clara looked surprised by the intensity in his tone. "This one, I'm not entirely sure. I found the sheet music in my grandmother's trunk, along with the violin. It wasn't with the other music. It was tucked inside the lining of the case, like someone had hidden it there." Samuel's mind was racing. How had his composition ended up in an old violin case in Silver Creek? "The piece is called Elegy for a Lost Dream," he said quietly. Clara's eyes widened. "Tony, you know it. But I've never heard anyone else play it." Samuel took a deep breath. It was time to tell Clara the truth, or at least part of it. "I know it because I wrote it," he said simply. The words hung in the cold air between them like a confession. Clara stared at him, her violin still tucked beneath her chin, her bow frozen in midair. "You're a composer," she whispered. "I was," Samuel said. "I used to teach at the Boston Conservatory of Music. That piece was written for my advanced students. I never published it. I have no idea how it ended up in your grandmother's violin case." Clara lowered her violin slowly, her eyes never leaving Samuel's face. "What's your full name?" she asked. "Samuel Turner," Clara gasped. "Professor Samuel Turner, the Samuel Turner who wrote Symphony for the Prairie Wind." Now it was Samuel's turn to be shocked. "You know my work?" "No," Clara laughed, but there were tears in her eyes. "Professor Turner, my grandmother, had every piece of sheet music she could find with your name on it. She used to play your compositions for me when I was little. And she'd tell me stories about this brilliant composer who understood the heart of American music better than anyone." Samuel felt the world tipping sideways. "What was your grandmother's name?" "Moira O'Sullivan," Clara said. "She taught music in Boston for a few years before she came west to get married. She always said she'd studied under the most wonderful teacher." The pieces fell into place so suddenly that Samuel had to sit down on a nearby crate. Moira O'Sullivan. He remembered her now, a young Irish woman with a gift for violin who'd been one of his first students 15 years earlier. She'd been talented, dedicated, and passionate about music, but she'd also been in love with a man heading west to try his luck in the silver mines. Samuel had given her copies of several of his compositions as a farewell gift, including the handwritten manuscript of Elegy for a Lost Dream. "Your grandmother was one of my first students," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was incredibly talented." Clara sank down onto the crate beside him. She never stopped playing. Even when times were hard, she never stopped making music. She said it was what kept her connected to the best parts of herself. The next morning, Samuel knocked on the door of Murphy's General Store just as Clara was finishing her morning duties. He'd spent most of the night thinking, and he'd come to a decision. "I have a proposition for you," he said when Clara answered the door. "I'd like to give you proper violin lessons. Music theory, composition, everything your grandmother would have wanted you to learn." Clara's face lit up. "Really, you'd do that for me?" "I'd do it for both of us," Samuel said. "I need to remember how to be a teacher again, and you have a gift that deserves to be nurtured properly." They arranged to meet every afternoon in the empty schoolhouse. The first lesson was a revelation for both of them. Samuel quickly realized that Clara's musical instincts were even more refined than he'd initially thought. She could hear harmonies, intuitively could improvise variations on melodies that showed deep understanding of musical structure. But her technique needed work. Years of playing a poorly maintained violin had led to bad habits that needed correcting. "We're going to start from the beginning," Samuel told her as he showed her the proper way to hold her bow. "I know it might feel like going backward, but I want to give you a solid foundation to build on. Clara was an eager student. She absorbed everything Samuel taught her with the hunger of someone who'd been waiting her entire life for this opportunity. You have something that can't be taught, Samuel told her one afternoon. You have the ability to make music speak directly to people's hearts. While Clara progressed rapidly under Samuel's instruction, he made a decision that would change everything. He'd been carrying a secret since arriving in Silver Creek. He owned a violin that was currently stored in Boston, a beautiful instrument made by a German craftsman in the 1840s. He'd kept it because it had been his sister's favorite. Margaret hadn't been a musician herself, but she'd loved listening to Samuel play, and this particular violin had always produced the sounds that moved her most. After her death, he couldn't bear to sell it, but he also couldn't bear to play it. Now, looking at Clara's broken instrument, held together with wire and hope, Samuel realized he'd found the perfect purpose for his violin. He arranged for the instrument to be shipped to Silver Creek immediately. When the package arrived 2 weeks later, Samuel brought it to the schoolhouse where Clara was practicing. "Clara, I want you to have this," Samuel said, opening the case. To reveal the gleaming instrument inside, Clara stopped playing and stared at the violin in the case. Even someone with no knowledge of violins could tell it was extraordinarily valuable. "Professor Turner, I can't possibly accept that. It must be worth a fortune." "It's worth exactly what someone is willing to pay for it," Samuel said. "And right now, I'm willing to give it to someone who will use it to create beautiful music." With trembling hands, Clara lifted the violin from its case. The moment she tucked it beneath her chin and drew the bow across the strings, the difference was astounding. Where her old violin had produced thin, sometimes scratchy tones, this instrument sang with a richness and clarity that filled the entire schoolhouse. It was on a Thursday in February that Samuel's past caught up with him. He'd just returned from the post office when he found a letter waiting for him at the boarding house. The return address made his hands shake. It was from the Boston Conservatory of Music. The letter was from Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the new director of the conservatory, telling him that the Chicago Symphony Orchestra wanted to perform his compositions and asking him to conduct. It was the kind of opportunity that could restore his reputation and put him back at the center of American musical life. But as he sat in his small boarding house room, all he could think about was Clara. How could he leave just when she was making such remarkable progress? When Samuel finally showed Clara the letter, her reaction surprised him. Instead of the disappointment he'd expected to see in her eyes, he saw something that looked almost like pride. "The Chicago Symphony Orchestra," she said, reading the letter again. "Professor Turner, this is incredible. Of course you have to go back to Boston." Samuel studied her face, looking for signs of the hurt he was sure she must be feeling. "But what about your lessons? What about your music?" "Then what do you suggest?" Clara asked. Samuel took a deep breath. "Come with me," he said simply. "Come to Boston. I'll arrange for you to audition at the conservatory. You could study with the best teachers in the country." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on her new violin. When she finally looked up at Samuel, there were tears in her eyes. "Professor Turner, that's an incredibly generous offer, but I can't accept it. I have responsibilities here. This is my home." "Why not?" Samuel asked. "Clara, you're 22 years old. Your grandmother would have wanted you to pursue your music, wouldn't she? Then don't let fear hold you back from the life you're meant to live. Word of Samuel's potential return to Boston and Clara's possible departure spread through Silver Creek like wildfire. Instead of indifference, there was genuine concern about losing Clara. Over the months of her lessons with Samuel, people had grown accustomed to hearing beautiful music drifting from the schoolhouse. Jake Morrison, the saloon owner, showed up at the boarding house one evening with a proposition. The folks in this town have gotten used to having something special right here in Silver Creek, he said. So we've been talking, and we think maybe we can help. The Merchants Association thinks we might be able to raise some money to help with travel expenses, maybe even contribute something toward her schooling. It ain't charity, it's an investment. We're investing in one of our own. News of Clara's farewell concert spread through Silver Creek faster than a prairie fire. On the night of the concert, the hall was packed beyond capacity. People had come from miles around to hear the young woman who'd become something of a local legend. When Clara walked onto the stage, the audience erupted in applause before she'd even raised her violin. She began with amazing grace, played with such beauty and reverence that you could have heard a pin drop in the packed hall. Then she moved to one of Samuel's compositions, the same piece her grandmother had treasured. For her final piece, Clara played something entirely her own, a composition she'd been working on during her lessons with Samuel. It told the story of her journey from the broken violin on the street corner to this moment. When the last note faded, the silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then the applause began. Not polite concert hall clapping, but the kind of thunderous, sustained appreciation that comes from the heart. 3 weeks later, Samuel and Clara stood on the platform at Silver Creek's train station, surrounded by what seemed like half the town. Mrs. Murphy was there with a basket of food for the journey. Jake Morrison had contributed enough money to cover their train tickets and then some. As the train whistle sounded in the distance, Clara looked around at the faces of people who'd become her family. "I won't forget this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I won't forget any of you." As the train pulled into the station, Samuel watched Clara say her goodbyes. 6 months ago, he'd been a broken man running from his grief and his failures. Now, standing here with this remarkable young woman who'd reminded him why music mattered, he felt more hopeful about the future than he had in years. Clara climbed aboard the train and found a seat by the window. As Silver Creek slowly disappeared behind them, she pressed her hand against the glass and whispered a promise to the town that had given her everything. The train carried them east, toward Boston, toward the conservatory, toward a world where broken violins could be mended and dreams could come true. Behind them, Silver Creek continued its daily life, but it was forever changed by the music that had lived within its boundaries, even if only briefly. Years later, when Clara Bell O'Sullivan became one of America's most celebrated violinists, she would always begin her concerts the same way, with a simple folk tune played on a violin that had once been held together with wire and hope. And in the audience, if you knew where to look, you might spot a distinguished gentleman with tears in his eyes, remembering a cold December night when music had saved them both. The broken violin, carefully restored and placed in a place of honor in Clara's home, served as a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unlikely places. And sometimes, when you have nothing left but hope and the courage to keep playing. That's exactly when miracles begin.